Hello everyone. Today's video is going to be about estimating and rounding numbers. So what we've practiced is placing numbers between multiples of 10, multiples of 100, multiples of thousands, and multiples of 10,000s. Today we're going to practice rounding those numbers to the nearest 10 and to the nearest 100. Just like we did on the number line, rounding and estimating just means which one is it closer to. The purpose of rounding and estimating is to make our operations easier. It's much easier to add 20 plus 30 than it is to add 23 plus 37. So rounding is always just done to make everything a little bit more simplified. Alright, so the first thing you need to do is, of course, make sure you have your title on the top of your paper, and then you need to divide your paper in half across where the middle hole is. So you should have those two sections. Now on that top section, the first thing I need you to do is draw this. It kind of looks like a roller coaster. That's going to be the number line that we're going to be using as a visual to help us see which side of the number line the number we're talking about is closest to. So after you draw that, you need to label up at the very top the number 5. That's our midpoint. Right in the middle is the 5. Then down is the 0, and then we can start labeling our 1, 2, 3, and 4. And on the other side, the 6, the 7, the 8, and the 9. So your notes should look like this. You should have the little roller coaster number line on one side, and then you should still have space left over for the notes we're going to write. Okay, so here we're going to go over the steps for rounding a number. These are the steps that you're going to follow whenever you have a number that you need to round before you use it for either addition or subtraction. Okay, so your first step is to underline the number in the place you are rounding to. For example, if we're rounding to the tens, then you underline the number that's in the tens. If you're rounding to the hundreds, then you underline the number that's in the hundreds. In third grade, those are the only two places that you're going to need to round to, either the tens or the hundreds. So your next step is to circle the number to the right of that number that you just underlined, and this is called your helper number. Don't worry if these steps don't make too much sense to you right now. We're going to practice all of them in just a bit. Now the last step is to look at that helper number, and if it's 4 or less, you let it rest. That's this part of the number line right here. Because if it's 4 or less, that means it's closer to this 0 or to the multiple that comes before it, so you leave it alone, you let it rest. If that helper number is 5 or more, you add one more. That's this part of our number line over here. Because that tells me that if it's 5 or more, it's closer to the next multiple. All the numbers to the left of the underlined number stay the same. All the numbers to the right become 0. Okay, so now I'm just labeling my number line. 4 or less, let it rest. 5 or more, add one more. Make sure you're doing this in the same colors that I am. So now your notes should look like this with all of the notes that I just did up on top. So now what I need you to do is divide that bottom section in half also, right across here. So now you should have 1, 2, 3 sections. You don't need to number them, that's just for you to see, and we're going to be working on this section right here next. Okay, so now we're going to practice using those steps to round a couple of numbers. The first thing we're going to do is round to the nearest 10. Like I said, in third grade, you only have to round either to the nearest 10 or to the nearest 100. So the first number I'm going to use is 643. My first step is to underline the number in the place we are rounding to. We're rounding to the tens, so I need to underline my number 4. Now I need to circle the number to the right of it, and that's my helper number. So in my mind, I need to be picturing the number lines like the ones we've used before. If I'm looking at multiples of 10, then I know that 643 is between 640 and 650. You should already be thinking which of those two multiples is it most close to. Okay, so now going by our rule, our helper number says 4 or less, let it rest. 5 or more, add one more. So 3 is less than 4, therefore it says to let it rest. What that means is that the underlined number, I'm just going to leave it alone. I don't need to do anything to it. It stays a 4. Then all the numbers to the left stay the same. All the numbers to the right become a 0. So by following my steps and my rules of 4 or less, let it rest, 5 or more, add 1 more, I can see that 643 is closer to 640 than it is to 650. So now let's practice doing the same thing with the 4-digit number. I'm going to have 2,387. Again, I need to look at my tens place. The 8 is the number I'm going to underline because it's in the tens place. The 7 is my helper number. Now, if I'm looking at multiples of 10, I can see that 2,380 is on one side of the number, and 2,390 is on the other side. 2,387 is between those two multiples. So already start thinking in your head, visualizing that number line, which of those two multiples is it closest to? So now let's use our rule. 4 or less, let it rest. 5 or more, add 1 more. My helper, my number 7, is more than 5. So the rule says 5 or more, add 1 more. My 8 that I underlined, I need to add 1 more. That makes it 9. Everything to the left stays the same. Everything to the right becomes a 0. That tells me that this number is rounded to 2,390. I should have pictured in my head that on the number line, it would be closer to 2,390. So now your notes should look like this with the spot that we just filled in and the notes right there. Okay, so now we're going to practice rounding to the nearest 100. The first number I'm going to use is 782. I need to underline the number in the place I'm rounding to. Since now I'm rounding to the hundreds, the 7 is the one that I'm going to underline. My 8 is my helper. Since I'm looking at the hundreds, I should see that 782 is between 700 and 800 on a number line. Again, start picturing in your head, based on that number line, which one of the two would it be closer to? Okay, so following my rules, 4 or less, let it rest. 5 or more, add 1 more. My 8 is more than the 5, so I'm going to add 1 more to my underlying number. That 7 now becomes an 8. I don't have anything to the left, but everything to the right becomes a 0. And that tells me that it was closest to 800 on the number line, so I'm rounding it to 800. Now let's try this with a 5-digit number. 67,226. I'm still looking at my hundreds, so this first 2 is in my hundreds place. The next 2 is my helper number. I can see that this number is between 67,200 and 67,300. Okay, so again, picture in your head, which one is it closest to? Is it closest to the 67,200 or the 67,300? Now, according to my helper number, 4 or less, let it rest. 5 or more, add 1 more. 2 is less than 4, therefore it says to let it rest. I'm going to leave it alone and I'm not going to do anything to it. Everything to the left stays the same. Everything to the right becomes a 0. That tells me that this number is rounded to 67,200. That's the one it would be closest to on the number line. So now that we did that second practice, your notes should be complete. They should look something like this. Make sure you have everything on there nice and neat so you can read it and be prepared to discuss. Bye.